The operation was already failing when the first warning came in. An experienced intelligence officer, operating under diplomatic cover in a Middle Eastern capital, realized something was wrong. Surveillance patterns had shifted. Meetings that were supposed to remain invisible were suddenly drawing attention. Safe routes no longer felt safe. And most disturbing of all, the pressure wasn't coming from an enemy service. It was coming from an ally. At that moment, two intelligence agencies that publicly claimed to be close partners were silently interfering with each other's moves. Both were tracking the same political network. Both believed they had priority, and neither trusted the other enough to step aside. What followed was not an explosion, not an arrest, not a public scandal. It was a quiet intelligence collision that forced one side to abort an operation that had taken years to build. The real question isn't whether this happened. The question is why it was never talked about, and which of these two powerful services blinked first. To understand how Mossad and MI6 ended up working against each other while claiming to be partners, you have to go back to the moment both agencies were shaped by uncertainty. After the Second World War, Britain was no longer the empire it once was. Its intelligence service, MI6, was still powerful, but it was adjusting to a world where influence had to be maintained quietly rather than enforced openly. Its power was now one of shadows and whispers, not flags and armies. At the same time, Israel emerged as a new state surrounded by hostility. Its intelligence agency, Mossad, was forged in a crucible of survival. For Israel, intelligence wasn't about projecting influence. It was about preventing annihilation. From the outside, cooperation between British and Israeli intelligence seemed perfectly logical. They shared enemies, operated in overlapping regions, and both stood to benefit from exchanging information. It was a match made in geopolitical heaven, or so it seemed. But intelligence agencies aren't driven by goodwill. They are driven by national interest, institutional pride, and a deep-rooted, almost professional mistrust. From its very beginning, Mossad viewed all foreign services, including friendly ones, as potential risks. Every ally was a potential liability. Every shared secret was a potential weakness. MI6, for its part, never fully accepted Israel as an equal intelligence partner. Britain's spies saw themselves as the old masters of the game, and they were accustomed to operating independently in regions they still considered within their strategic sphere. This created a strange, contradictory relationship. Information was shared, but never fully. Assistance was offered, but often with a delay that rendered it useless. Joint interests existed, but their priorities rarely aligned. What looked like cooperation from a distance was often just parallel play. Both agencies were running their own operations in the same environments, sometimes even against the same targets, but without any real coordination. They were like two sharks circling the same prey, each one wary of the other. The Middle East became the primary arena for this silent rivalry. Britain had spent decades building political relationships, intelligence networks, and local influence across the region. Even after its formal withdrawal from empire, MI6 maintained assets and channels that it considered long-term, invaluable investments. These were networks cultivated over generations. Israel, meanwhile, saw the region not as a former empire, but as an immediate security perimeter. Its very existence depended on what happened there. Mossad's approach was consequently faster, more aggressive, and far more willing to take risks that traditional European services like MI6 would avoid. This fundamental difference in mindset was everything. MI6 valued long-term political stability and quiet leverage. Their goal was to gently guide events, not to blow them up. Mossad, however, prioritized immediate threat neutralization and intelligence dominance. They wanted to eliminate dangers, not just manage them. So when both agencies encountered the same actors, whether they were politicians, militants, financiers, or shadowy intermediaries, their objectives often clashed. One side wanted access, a seat at the table. The other wanted control, the ability to dictate the outcome. And neither agency wanted the other to be the one shaping events. Over time, this constant low-level tension produced a predictable pattern. Mossad officers learned that British intelligence was not always a neutral partner. MI6 officers learned that Israeli operatives were not content to simply play supporting roles in Britain's grand strategy. And so, each service began monitoring not only hostile intelligence agencies, but each other. Surveillance, counter-surveillance, and asset protection quietly expanded to include allied personnel who were operating in the same space. The game had a new, unspoken layer. You had to watch your enemies, but you also had to watch your friends. This is where the idea of a spy war between them becomes misleading. There were no gunfights in darkened alleys, no dramatic defections, no public betrayals splashed across newspaper headlines. Instead, the conflict was fought with small, deniable acts of obstruction. It was a war of 1,000 paper cuts. A crucial meeting would suddenly be compromised by an unexpected police raid. Access to a key official would be quietly denied for security reasons. A critical warning about a threat would be passed along, but just late enough to be useless. Each move was carefully designed to protect one nation's interests without triggering a full-blown diplomatic fallout. One of the most uncomfortable truths in intelligence history is that alliances are almost always transactional. They are partnerships of convenience, not of conviction. MI6 and Mossad cooperated when it suited them and competed when it did not. Both services understood that exposing this rivalry would damage not just their bilateral relations, but also broader Western alliances. That mutual awareness created an unspoken rule: interfere quietly, deny publicly, and never, ever leave evidence. This rivalry was also shaped by perception and culture. British intelligence often saw Israeli operations as too visible, too disruptive, and potentially destabilizing to their carefully laid plans. They saw Mossad as a bull in a china shop. Israeli intelligence, in turn, often viewed British caution as a sign of weakness or indecision. They saw MI6 as too slow, too tied to protocol, and unwilling to do what was necessary. These judgments were rarely spoken aloud in formal meetings, but they heavily influenced operational decisions on the ground. When trust erodes in the world of intelligence, every shared detail becomes a potential vulnerability, a weapon that could be used against you. By the late Cold War period, both agencies had adapted to this strange reality. Mossad focused on expanding its independent networks, minimizing any reliance on foreign services for critical operations. They learned to go it alone. MI6, meanwhile, refined its use of diplomatic and political intelligence channels, reducing its exposure to the fallout from unilateral actions by allies like Israel. Cooperation continued, of course, but it was carefully managed, compartmentalized, and often filtered through political leadership rather than being coordinated directly between operational teams. Trust was a rare commodity. What makes this rivalry so fascinating is not that it existed, but that it was never acknowledged. Unlike conflicts with adversarial services like the KGB, there was absolutely no incentive for either side to reveal the friction between them. Silence served everyone. Governments avoided embarrassment. Intelligence leaders avoided difficult questions from their political masters. And the public remained completely unaware that partnership and rivalry can exist at the exact same time between the very same people. The incident I described at the beginning, the aborted operation, was not an exception. It was a symptom of a broader intelligence reality that still exists today. When two highly capable services operate in the same shadows, competition isn't just possible, it's inevitable. The only real difference between how you treat an ally and how you treat an enemy is how carefully that competition is concealed. By the end of this series, the unanswered question will no longer be whether Mossad and MI6 competed against each other. It will be how often this happens between allies today, how much of what we call cooperation is actually just carefully controlled rivalry. And that final detail, the one I withheld at the beginning, the identity of which agency forced the other's operation to collapse it, matters less than the lesson itself. In the world of intelligence, the most dangerous interference often comes from the side you least expect. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, make sure to follow for the next part of the story. At first glance, Mossad and MI6 appeared to be natural partners. Both operated in the same regions, monitored many of the same political movements, and viewed instability in the Middle East as a strategic concern. During the Cold War, both intelligence services were deeply focused on preventing rival powers from gaining influence in key states. Yet beneath this apparent alignment, their priorities were fundamentally different. And those differences shaped every interaction between them. For MI6, the Middle East was a region of legacy and leverage. Britain's influence did not disappear with the end of formal colonial rule. Networks built over decades remained active through diplomacy, business, military training programs, and intelligence relationships. MI6's mission was to preserve access and influence quietly, ensuring Britain remained relevant in a region where power was shifting but not settled. Stability, even under imperfect regimes, was often seen as preferable to disruption. Mossad approached the same region from a position of vulnerability rather than legacy. Israel's intelligence doctrine was shaped by existential threat, not global reach. Every political shift, militant network, or covert alliance in neighboring states had the potential to become an immediate security risk. Mossad's focus was narrower but more intense. It was less concerned with long-term influence and more concerned with preventing surprises, even if that meant aggressive or unilateral action. These different strategic cultures created friction, even when the enemy appeared to be the same. Both agencies monitored armed groups, political factions, and foreign intelligence penetration, but they often disagreed on how those threats should be handled. MI6 preferred observation, influence, and quiet manipulation. Mossad favored disruption, exposure, and preemption. When both agencies encountered the same actors, cooperation became complicated. One recurring problem was access to human assets. Informants are the most valuable currency in intelligence work, and the Middle East produced some of the most contested sources in the world. Politicians, military officers, financiers, and intermediaries were often approached by multiple intelligence services simultaneously. When MI6 believed it had cultivated a long-term asset, Mossad sometimes viewed that same individual as a short-term threat requiring immediate action. This difference in assessment could derail years of careful positioning. From Mossad's perspective, delayed action could be fatal. Intelligence that sat unused was intelligence that could turn against Israel. From MI6's perspective, premature action could collapse broader networks and destabilize political arrangements Britain still depended on. These opposing calculations meant that even shared intelligence could lead to opposite conclusions. As a result, information sharing became selective. Details were withheld, timelines blurred, and assessments softened or sharpened depending on which service controlled the flow. This was not always done out of malice. Often, it was done out of institutional habit. Intelligence agencies exist to protect their own operational freedom first, even when working with partners. Another source of tension was political access. MI6 traditionally worked closely with political elites, royal families, and senior officials across the region. These relationships were built on discretion and continuity. Mossad, while also maintaining political channels, placed greater emphasis on covert penetration and unconventional access. This sometimes led to Mossad gaining insights MI6 did not control, which in turn made British intelligence uncomfortable. The reverse also occurred. MI6 occasionally had access to diplomatic discussions and political negotiations that Mossad was excluded from. When intelligence derived from these channels was shared only partially or late, Israeli operatives interpreted it as deliberate sidelining. Over time, suspicion replaced assumption of good faith. Cold War dynamics further complicated the relationship. Both agencies were operating in an environment where global powers were competing for influence through proxies, alliances, and covert support. Britain was attempting to maintain relevance alongside larger powers, while Israel was navigating relationships that could shift rapidly under pressure. Each agency had to consider not just its allies' intentions, but how information might be used by others down the line. This led to an unspoken rule: trust, but verify constantly. Mossad officers learned to assume that shared intelligence might be incomplete. MI6 officers learned to assume that Israeli operations might proceed without warning. This mutual caution shaped operational planning and reduced the possibility of genuine coordination. At times, cooperation worked smoothly. Intelligence was exchanged. Threats were monitored, and interests aligned closely enough to prevent conflict. But these moments were often temporary. Structural differences in mission and mindset ensured that cooperation was always conditional. One of the most sensitive areas of overlap involved covert action. MI6 historically preferred deniability through influence rather than direct intervention. Mossad was more willing to act decisively if leadership believed a threat required removal or disruption. When these approaches collided, the risk was not just operational failure, but diplomatic fallout. British intelligence feared being implicated in actions it did not authorize. Israeli intelligence feared being constrained by partners who did not share its urgency. This mutual anxiety made coordination fragile and encouraged parallel operations rather than joint ones. As a result, both agencies increasingly treated each other as variables to be managed rather than partners to be trusted fully. Counterintelligence measures were quietly applied even within shared environments. Monitoring of movements, communications, and contacts was not limited to hostile services. Allies were observed too. What makes this chapter of intelligence history difficult to document is that none of these actions violated official agreements openly. There were no declarations of hostility, no public disputes, and no formal breakdown of relations. Everything occurred within the gray zone where plausible deniability protected both sides. By the time both agencies had decades of shared experience behind them, the pattern was clear. Mossad and MI6 could cooperate effectively against external threats, but only as long as their core interests did not collide. When they did, each agency prioritized its own objectives, quietly accepting that the other would do the same. This reality explains why so many intelligence failures and near misses involving allies never surface publicly. The damage is absorbed internally, lessons are learned quietly, and operations move on. Exposure serves no one. This reveals that the rivalry between Mossad and MI6 was not driven by ideology or hostility. It was driven by incompatible priorities operating in the same space. Shared enemies did not guarantee shared strategies, and cooperation did not eliminate competition. When intelligence rivalry moves beyond planning rooms and into the field, it rarely announces itself. There are no confrontations, no accusations, and no official complaints. Instead, interference is subtle, calculated, and designed to look accidental. Between Mossad and MI6, this form of quiet competition became a recurring feature of operations where interests overlapped but authority did not. In shared operational environments, both agencies maintained a public posture of cooperation, while privately assuming the other was acting independently. This assumption shaped behavior on the ground. Officers were instructed to protect their own sources, limit disclosures, and prepare contingency plans in case Allied activity compromised an operation. The result was parallel intelligence campaigns running side by side, often unaware of how closely they were being watched. One common point of friction involves surveillance. Intelligence officers rely on carefully constructed routines to avoid detection. When those routines are disrupted, suspicion immediately follows. In several instances across different theaters, operatives from one service noticed unfamiliar surveillance patterns that did not match known hostile services. These patterns were often too disciplined, too cautious and too selective to belong to local security forces. The implication was uncomfortable but unavoidable. An Allied service was watching. This kind of monitoring was not necessarily hostile in intent. Sometimes it was precautionary. MI6 wanted to know whether Israeli operations might expose British assets. Mossad wanted to ensure British intelligence was not inadvertently compromising Israeli objectives. However, surveillance has consequences. The mere presence of additional observers increases the risk of exposure, especially in tightly controlled environments. Another recurring issue was asset collision. Human sources rarely operate exclusively for one service unless carefully protected. In politically complex regions, individuals often provide information to multiple parties, sometimes knowingly and sometimes without understanding the implications. When Mossad and MI6 discovered they were interacting with the same source, the situation became dangerous. From MI6's perspective, a long-term political source required patience and protection. From Mossad's perspective, the same individual might represent an immediate operational risk. When one service acted without consulting the other, relationships collapsed, assets disappeared, changed behavior, or were abruptly removed from access. Each side blamed the other privately, while publicly maintaining silence. Interference also took more passive forms. Intelligence warnings were sometimes delivered too late to be useful. Operational details were shared incompletely. Requests for clarification were delayed. None of these actions could be proven malicious, but their cumulative effect was damaging. Operations slowed, trust eroded further, and both agencies became more defensive. In certain cases, this behavior bordered on silent retaliation. If one service believed the other had compromised an operation, the response was rarely direct. Instead, cooperation in future cases became more limited. Access was reduced. Information flows tightened. The message was implicit rather than spoken. Actions have consequences, even among allies. What made this rivalry particularly complex was the need to maintain plausible deniability at all times. Open conflict between Allied intelligence services would trigger political fallout neither government wanted. As a result, disputes were handled internally, often without written records or formal complaints. Senior officials were briefed selectively, and operational leaders were expected to resolve problems quietly. The psychology of intelligence professionals played a significant role in this dynamic. Officers are trained to distrust appearances and assume hidden motives. When an ally's behavior appears inconsistent or inconvenient, suspicion fills the gap. Over time, this mindset hardens into doctrine. Mossad operatives learned to assume that MI6 would act in Britain's interests first. MI6 officers learned to assume Mossad would act independently, regardless of diplomatic sensitivities. This mutual understanding reduced surprise but increased distance. Joint operations became rare. Coordination was minimized. Each service planned as if operating alone, even when occupying the same space. The risk of duplication, interference, and unintended exposure increased, but so did institutional comfort. Independence felt safer than reliance. One of the most sensitive aspects of this rivalry involved covert political influence. Both agencies sought access to decision-makers who could shape regional outcomes. When influence campaigns overlapped, the potential for interference grew. A policy shift encouraged by one service could undermine years of quiet effort by the other. When this happened, frustration was absorbed internally rather than expressed openly. The absence of public evidence does not mean these incidents were insignificant. Intelligence agencies measure success and failure differently from the public. A missed opportunity, a compromised source, or a delayed operation can alter strategic outcomes without ever appearing in headlines. In this sense, the rivalry between Mossad and MI6 had real consequences, even if they were never acknowledged. Over time, both agencies adapted. Mossad refined its operational security to limit exposure to Allied observation. MI6 strengthened internal compartmentalization to reduce the risk of unintended sharing. These adjustments reduced friction, but did not eliminate it. The underlying tension remained. What distinguished this rivalry from outright hostility was restraint. Both sides understood the cost of escalation. Interference was calibrated carefully, designed to protect interests without provoking response. This restraint required discipline and experience, and it became an unspoken rule of engagement. By the end of this period, Mossad and MI6 had settled into a cautious equilibrium. Cooperation existed, but it was narrow. Competition existed, but it was controlled. Neither side trusted the other completely, but neither sought confrontation. The most important question surrounding the rivalry between Mossad and MI6 is not whether it existed, but why it was never openly acknowledged. Intelligence conflicts between adversaries are often revealed years later through leaks, memoirs, or declassified files. Conflicts between allies, however, are treated differently. Silence is not just preferred. It is enforced. One reason is political cost. Britain and Israel maintained official diplomatic relations built on cooperation, security coordination, and strategic dialogue. Publicly admitting that their intelligence services interfered with each other would have undermined trust at the highest levels of government. It would have raised uncomfortable questions in parliaments, strained alliances, and forced leaders to explain actions they could neither confirm nor deny. Another reason is institutional self-protection. Intelligence agencies survive on credibility. Admitting that an allied service successfully disrupted operations would be seen internally as failure. Both Mossad and MI6 had strong incentives to contain disputes quietly, resolve damage internally, and move forward without leaving a paper trail. In intelligence culture, unresolved silence is often preferable to documented embarrassment. There was also mutual benefit in secrecy. Despite rivalry, both agencies gained from maintaining the appearance of cooperation. Intelligence sharing, even if limited, still provided value. Joint political alignment still served broader strategic interests. Exposing conflict would have reduced operational flexibility for both sides and invited scrutiny from adversaries eager to exploit cracks in allied relationships. Governments understood this dynamic and often reinforced it. Political leaders rarely demand full transparency from intelligence agencies, when plausible deniability protects national interests. As long as disputes remained contained and did not escalate into public crises, silence was seen as stability. This created an environment where quiet rivalry could continue without consequence. Over time, rivalry itself became normalized. New generations of officers inherited doctrines shaped by past experience. Mossad operatives were trained to assume autonomy even among partners. MI6 officers were trained to manage allies cautiously rather than rely on them fully. What began as situational friction hardened into institutional memory. This pattern did not end with the Cold War. Modern intelligence cooperation still carries the same contradictions. Agencies share information while withholding details. They collaborate while preparing for interference. They trust just enough to function, but never enough to surrender control. The Mossad-MI6 relationship was not an exception. It was a case study. The incident introduced at the beginning of this series fits this pattern precisely. The operation did not fail because of incompetence or enemy action. It failed because two allied services pursued overlapping objectives without aligning priorities. One service protected its interests. The other absorbed the setback. Neither protested publicly. Both moved on. What matters is not which agency forced the collapse. What matters is that neither could admit it happened. In intelligence work, truth is often less important than containment. Damage is assessed internally. Lessons are learned quietly, and the story disappears into classified archives. This is why the spy war between Mossad and MI6 remains largely unknown. Not because it was insignificant, but because revealing it would challenge the comforting myth that allies always act in harmony. Intelligence history is far messier than diplomatic language suggests. Understanding this rivalry changes how intelligence cooperation should be viewed today. Partnerships are real, but conditional. Trust exists, but with limits. And behind every shared briefing lies an unspoken calculation about who benefits most from what is revealed. The silence surrounding this story is itself the conclusion. Intelligence agencies do not expose rivalries that serve their interests. They bury them, refine their methods, and continue operating in the same shadows, sometimes side by side, sometimes in each other's way. If this story changed how you see intelligence alliances and the quiet rivalries behind them, make sure you subscribe to Spy Shadows. The next episode dives into another intelligence partnership that wasn't as united as it appeared, and once you hear it, you'll never look at alliances the same way again.